Okay, hi everybody. This is my second go at this. Apparently yesterday I recorded it for you and streamed it off into nowhere. So I am going to do this again so you have it available. All right, so chapter 13 and 14, as I said, what I'm going to do is give you an abbreviated, quick run through where I focus on, topics that I think you might struggle with a little bit or that you might need more of. And then what I'll do is I will check your discussion boards and I will make more in-depth presentations about that. From this point on, I'm going to be putting these up on YouTube. Those will be available in your Blackboard. OneDrive is already full and I am not paying for a separate monthly fee, so we'll be doing it this way. And Google Drive is not working for everybody. So hopefully this works out and I don't get too many complaints about this method, but we will see. All right, so a lot of this particular chapter should be review from what you did in lab already. You know what the brain looks like. You should know what these regions are. I want to make sure that you can tell the four major divisions of the brain apart and know what each one of them does. So you should know everything that's on here already. All right, you should also know all of this information. You should know about the cerebrum. You should have a good idea of what it looks like along with this terminology. A lot of the information that is in this presentation is terminology. Like I said, I am really not big on note cards, but when it comes to this sort of thing, I highly recommend them, especially since you guys are apart from one another and it makes it a little more difficult to get together as a group and work on this. However, like I told you at the beginning of the semester, anatomy and physiology it's another language. It's a new language that you're learning. It's a language that is going to be used in your trade, just like any other trade. There are terms that go with it. So there is just a lot of memorization that is going to happen. And this is part of it. So if you are the type of person that learns from doing things visually, a lot of these slides really lend themselves to drawing things and making sure that you can label. And if you can do that, you're good to go. All right, same thing here. It goes over the cerebrum just like it does here, only you're looking at it from a different angle. Now, what's different about this slide is that it starts to get into dividing up the lobes of the cerebrum. You need to know which lobe is responsible for what. Now, keep in mind when we list these things. So, for example, in the frontal lobe, it says voluntary motor function, motivation, aggression, sense of smell, mood, personality, and decision making. Those do not only happen in the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe does do the heavy lifting for it, yes. But a lot of this information, a lot of the information that your body needs or is gathered from sensory organs, although it might be condensed in a particular area, there's lots of different things that occur in different regions of your brain that also will help you synthesize this different information. But for the purpose, well, just in general, for general purposes, make sure that you know what each lobe is associated with doing. So again, this lends itself to note cards. All right, I like this particular slide here because it color codes and shows you very simply. Pardon me if I'm talking over here. I've got a much better screen for me, but it shows you very simply the different regions of the brain. Again, you should know these by now. We are going to go further into the Broca area and the Wernicke area, which is really cool. So that's going to be a little different from something that you may have done in lab. Also, I'd like to point out, and we'll cover this again, and I'll point it out again in a minute, but your primary auditory cortex is pretty easy to remember because it's behind your ears. Literally, when you hear something, it is primarily processed by a portion of the brain that is right there. So that is extremely convenient. Whereas with the visual cortex, the information that you see with your eyes when you're looking at something has to travel all the way to the very back of your brain for processing. So I find that it's pretty easy to keep those apart. And I will wait on olfactory until we get to a different slide. All right, this slide, actually. All right, so again, this particular slide talks about where the bulk of processing is done in a particular region of the brain. So like I said, the visual cortex is in the back. Your auditory cortex is right beneath your ears. Your olfactory cortex, if you recall from lab, you saw those olfactory nerves that kind of look like flaps in the front of the brain, so that will sort of help you orient to that. But just make sure you can keep all of these straight as well. Now, this is not the actual structure of the brain itself. That's not something you are going to see in the lecture exam. That is something that is anatomical, less physiological, therefore it goes into the lab region. And you've done that. That was already in your practical one. So you should know it, but brush up on it. Primarily what I'm going to need from you from lecture in regards to this is knowing what each region is responsible for. I would also like to point out there is a description here that there's a region that is arranged as an upside down half homunculus. We're not going into that. If you're curious, as a matter of fact, I highly recommend you go Google what a homunculus is. It is entertaining, but I find it to be more confusing than anything else. Sorry if you hear any background noises. You guys are going to have to get used to that. That's just going to happen. Hopefully it doesn't distract me too much. All right, so skeletal muscles. We are moving after this particular section is done into muscles, and you are doing a heavy load of that in lab right now. So this gives you the opportunity to finally tie things together, because I know the labs have been off sync with the lecture, and it's even worse this semester than usual. There wasn't anything to be done for that. Let me see. All right, so we talked about reflexes, we talked about the motor system. Remember how much effort your body and your brain has put into working in a way that keeps you from falling over. That is one of the major drawbacks to being bipedal. We have to put a lot of energy into it, because if you fall over, you're kind of likely to hurt yourself. So you'll see that over and over again, different checks and balances that your brain uses to keep you upright. All right, so know the difference between reflexes and voluntary movements. Voluntary movements are something consciously activated. So if I wanted to pick up a pen, I know that I need to reach my arm out, pick up the pen, and grab it to bring it up here. However, there are some voluntary motions that you do so often you don't think about them. That does not make them a reflex. So for example, if you are a touch typer, like say you use a QWERTY keyboard, for those of you that know what that is or don't, look at the top row of the letters on your keyboard. That's how it got the name. So if you use a QWERTY keyboard and you're a touch typer, those movements are voluntary. They haven't become reflexes just because you're good at them. So keep that in mind. Upper versus lower motor neurons, you want to make sure that you understand that. Again, that goes back to the chapter 12 stuff that we used. If you know what they're used for, then you're going to be able to put 2 and 2 together about where you might find them. And you should be able to tell me what the 3 steps are responsible for voluntary movements. So very much like you learned the reflexes, you're going to also make sure that you know how this works. So the premotor areas of the cerebral cortex are activated, and that stimulates the upper motor neuron. So you know you want to do something, premotor areas light up, and those upper motor neurons are stimulated. So the axons go down the descending nerve tract. So now that your brain is sending out an efferent signal. right? Once it gets to where it needs to go, it stimulates the lower motor neurons, which then goes out and causes the skeletal muscles to contract or to do what it is they need to do. So just make sure that you understand overall how that works. All right, this is another very important slide because it goes into detail about where things happen and what is happening in each region of the brain. So make sure, like make a note card and say premotor area. I'm not going to need for lecture that it's anterior to the primary motor cortex, but I do need to know that the premotor area is where motor functions are organized before anything even starts to happen. So you're going to see, as we move on, a lot of crossover. So if you see, for example, vision stimulation, or you'll see vision that kind of crosses over and is sort of being orchestrated by numerous parts of the brain or numerous small parts of the brain, you need to know, which are responsible for both relaying and interpreting what the information that you see. So the cerebrum is it's considered the higher brain. It's the higher order thinking tends to happen in the cerebrum. So planning, organizing, coordinating movements, posture, the things that, like I said, posture, falling over, the things that we have to focus on because we're bipeds. So a lot of that happens in the cerebrum too. Just keep that in mind, that's higher order thinking. We will down the road talk about the limbic system, which they call your lizard brain. You'll hear me talk about that again. But keep in mind that there are portions or signals that are sent that are stimulatory. So it stimulates your muscles to do something like rising from a chair, or honestly, even sitting down. And inhibitory, they're the ones that inhibit the activity in the antagonistic muscle. So instead of just reading that to you, remember that in the last chapter, I mentioned, I gave you the example where if you extended your arm and you flexed your bicep and your tricep at the same time and tried to move your arm, it wasn't going very far. So these signals that are sent out from the cerebrum not only contract one muscle group, but inhibit the opposite or antagonistic muscle group from contracting as well, so that you can actually move whatever part you are trying to move. And then the cerebellum helps maintain muscle tone, again, associated with your posture. It helps with balance and coordinates eye movements. Believe it or not, eye movements and hearing actually contribute to balance as well and can be thrown off pretty easily. Okay. All right. So higher brain functions, like I said, everything going on up top is a lot of the higher brain things that make us individual and very different from some other animals in the animal kingdom. Another one, and this one's really cool. This is the Wernicke and the Broca area. You need to be able to tell me how this works. You need to be able to sort of step by step understand this well enough that you could draw this out for me or put this in order depending on the prompt that I give you. So the Wernicke area, all right, so the Wernicke area is this area right here that is lit up in green. The Wernicke area is responsible for understanding what is heard and thinking about what you're going to say. So right now, part of your Wernicke area is functioning to process what I'm telling you. Less so thinking of what you will say in this case, but if you're having a conversation, there are multiple things that are going on in the Wernicke area. Now, that is what that region does. It takes that information once it's processed and it sends it through the arcuate fasciculus. I always have to say that slowly. The information travels through that connection and it moves to the Broca area. The Broca area is the portion that is responsible for motor speech. So Wernicke sends the message that you want to relay, but the Broca area actually stimulates the muscles to make the sound. There have been some really cool case studies about how this works. So for example, if you got into an accident and you had damaged that, the Broca area or the Broca region in your brain, you would hear me talking to you if we were having a conversation. You might have something that you want to say formulated, but by the time it gets to your Broca area, if it's damaged, what comes out of your mouth may be completely different or completely nonsensical. So it really can create some interesting results, and people are really good at, surviving in general and finding ways around things. It's one of the things that makes humans really neat and unique. So for example, I can't remember if it was a man or a woman, but there was a study that I read a long time ago where this person damaged the Broca area or had some kind of damage that happened and wasn't able to communicate by sharing, she knew what she wanted to say, but she couldn't get it out. What she did realize is that she could sing. And if she sang all of her responses, although it was a little slower, she was able to communicate what she was trying to communicate. And over time, with the help of physical therapists and doctors that were figuring this out, she was able to slowly restore her speech by using singing as a way to retrain her brain, to actually stimulate neural growth, to actually be able to talk again. And while it took a long time to get to the point where she was able to talk semi-normally again, it is just really cool that the singing comes from a different portion of the brain. Or partially from a different portion of the brain. So it was sort of a workaround. If you're curious about it, I definitely go look it up. It is super easy to find because it is a really fascinating thing, and there's lots of other ways that people have found workarounds for this, but these two regions work. They coordinate with each other for us to be able to communicate together. So make sure that if I were to say, in order to read aloud a word that is seen, it starts at the primary visual cortex because you saw it, right? So it is sent through the primary visual cortex to the Wernicke area. The Wernicke area understands what you're looking at and thinks about how you're going to respond. The Broca area actually takes the information to read the word aloud, and that goes to the primary motor cortex so that the muscles can be stimulated to do so. And you should also know, if I said, I want you to repeat a word that is heard, you should know the path that leads through that as well. All right, communication between right and left hemispheres. Now, you've probably heard on and off, it's something people think is very interesting, that the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left side of the body and the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right side of the body. That is not 100% true, but by and large, it is fairly well accepted that mostly that's what happens. But there is a lot of communication going on between the right side of the brain and the left side of the brain. And it happens between these commissures, specifically the one that we'll mention here. There are others, but primarily through the corpus callosum. So go back and look at your anatomy for the brain structure and kind of put 2 and 2 together on that. All right, so also another thing that they mention here and that you hear occasionally is that the left side of your brain does most of the mathematics and speech, whereas the right side of your brain does 3-dimensional spatial perception, recognition of faces, musical ability. It's the creative side of your brain. So after a decade of higher education to get a Ph.D., very little of which involved visual or creative arts in any way, shape, or form, when I graduated, other than being a biochemist and having to imagine my molecules and the three-dimensional shape, I was positive that the right side of my brain must have completely atrophied. So I started doing activities that forced me to use the right side of my brain. It came back a lot easier than I thought it would, actually. So when you are finished with your degree and you are not living in a place where you eat, live, and breathe science, do some things that stimulate the right side of your brain as well. I recommend you do them now if you can. It's actually better for you. It's actually very good for maintaining your IQ and your ability to do different things across the board. So don't just be left-brained or right-brained, even though it's not completely that way. Try and stimulate both with different activities. So make sure that you know what is responsible for what. All right, so here you have the cerebral medulla. This very much, again, is anatomy and being able to draw it and tell me where these fibers are and how these fibers are communicating and why they are important. So this is a note card slide for you. All right, so I remember the first time I saw this picture of the brainstem and what it looked like, and it just blew my mind that we have something like that completely alien looking inside of us. But the brainstem is that more primal part of your brain. It is where all of those automatic functions tend to occur. It is where the limbic system or the lizard brain is contained. So make sure that you know the three main regions of the brainstem, and we're going to break those down really quickly in the next few slides, and that it is the part that is essential for those autonomic functions. Now, just to orient you a little bit, here on this anterior view, if you were to be facing me, so if you put your back to this slide and face forward, that is the angle that you are looking at the brainstem from. So you would be looking at eyes on this side, ears facing you. So just to kind of help you, because when I first looked at this, like I sort of imagined that as the back of the brain. It is not. This is the front section of the brainstem. So keep that in mind when you're orienting yourself. All right, medulla oblongata regulates a ton of different things. So like I said, it's that autonomic stuff that really occurs here. Heart rate, blood vessel diameter, respiration, swallowing, vomiting, hiccuping, coughing, sneezing, all that stuff that you don't think about, it just sort of helps. What I want you to know with these slides is that I am not requiring that you necessarily know which cranial nerves originate from this region. I am not worried about that. That again is an anatomical thing. If you decide to go into some sort of neurological field, you will definitely need to know that, but for your lecture exam, do not worry about it too much. Also, that should have been on Practical 1. So you probably won't see that again. Even though Practical 2 is cumulative, it's only going to have a little bit from Practical 1 because I have so much that I want to make sure you know for 2. So just know where this is and what it does. All right, the pons is superior to the medulla oblongata, so it is above. It has ascending and descending fiber tracts. Look back to 2 slides so that you know which is which. I, again, do not need to know which cranial nerves originate from it, but I do need you to know that it is sort of a relay between the cerebrum and cerebellum. So when you're looking at this, I want you to think about the function of the cerebrum and the function of the cerebellum. What kind of information would they need relayed between one another? Also, and we'll get to this at the end of the lecture, I'm actually going to divide this into 2 parts. The sleep center is primarily located in the pons. We're going to have a long talk about sleep. Honestly, you could do a whole class on sleep all by itself, and I have before, but unfortunately we're not face to face, so that makes that difficult. And also know that the respiratory center communicates with the center of the pons in the medulla. All right, the midbrain, again, I'm not too worried about the origin of the nerves. The midbrain you'll hear also called the mesencephalon. It's not switched up terribly often. That's a term that you'll hear more frequently when you're doing embryology. So if you take an embryology course, you'll probably hear mesencephalon more than you hear midbrain. Know that the midbrain itself has superior and inferior colliculi, and you can see those. Let's see. Here we go. Here's your superior. Oh, no, that we have a very good. Interesting. All right. So again, I'm not going to ask you location of things. Just know that the superior colliculi are involved in visual reflexes and know where the information comes from, and that there are inferior colliculi that are involved in hearing. So that should give you another idea as to placement of where those are, because I said a lot of the processing that your brain needs to do for hearing is pretty close to where you're actually hearing things. The tracts, we did not divide those up a lot here for this course. I wanted you to know that there's an ascending tract. I want you to know that it is sometimes called, or one of them is sometimes called, the tegmentum and what it does. And then the descending tract, that's your efferent signal, right? That is where the motor impulses are fed down through your spinal cord to actually activate some kind of something going on with your body. So that's where the efferent signal travels through. All right, brainstem functions, like I said, all of that, most of that autonomic, limbic survival stuff happens in your brainstem. Know that, here we go again, the reticular activating system controls the sleep-wake cycle. We will talk about sleep towards the end of this lecture. But in order for your sleep-wake cycle to be stimulated, you need signals from your optic nerves, from your vestibulocochlear input. So again, cochlear, that is near your ears, right? That is actually just inside. It's not too terribly far from there. Wakefulness is maintained by information coming from the eyes and the ears, as well as the cerebral cortex. So this is where we really get messed up in today's technology. So, you know, a couple hundred years ago, when the sun went down, you had candles or you didn't have light. So you went to sleep because there wasn't a whole lot else that you could do, which is why people would often go to sleep early, and they would get up pretty much just as the sun was coming up. That is the sort of sleep cycle that we, in general, as humans, evolved to have. So then we had electricity was broadly available. People started staying up a little bit later because, well, they were able to see when the sun went down. I think that was the beginning of more sleep issues than people had really had previously. And then very recently, we started using technology. We have TVs, computers, cell phone, all kinds of stuff. And that emits a blue light. They have found that that blue light actually stimulates your brain, which really confuses it because you are not making the appropriate amount of hormone. Your brain has not registered that it is time to go to bed. So nowadays you hear all kinds of sleep issues. I don't know about you, but I, have a regular sleep schedule, but I don't usually go to bed till 1 or 2 in the morning, and I have a feeling a lot of you are pretty similar. And we'll talk more about sleep-wake schedules. But again, this has to do with just the way our society is and the way we are exposed to different lights. So you can actually do something about this. This is not something that just has to happen. There are, steps that you can take to get yourself in a more regular sleep cycle. And I know I'm preaching to the choir, but at the same time, I know you're not going to do it because you're college students. Just know that it can be done. Okay. All right, so with this particular slide here, I need you to know, I don't need you to know the cranial nerve specifically, but I need you to know what the somatic motor region does. So eye movements, reflexes, chewing, facial expression, swallowing, speech, all of that stuff going on primarily with your face happens in the somatic motor area of the brainstem. Parasympathetic, you need to know pupil constriction, sneeze, salivation, gagging, coughing. Those are all, actually, those are all part of your autonomic nervous system, correct? So make sure that you know those. I don't need to know that cranial nerve 3 is what's responsible for pupil restriction or constriction. Just make sure you know what each region does. All right, cerebellum. Again, a lot of anatomy on this slide. I'm not going to read it to you. Just make sure that you do know it. You're going to need it, even though you won't need it for your lecture exam. What I really want you to get from this slide in general is the cerebellar functions and what's happening in the cerebellum. So there's a whole slide where we talked about that. This is just going over the anatomy. I would like to point out that there is a region that I think is super cool called the arbor vitae, which literally translates to, and this is considered the arbor vitae, it literally translates to tree of life. Somebody looked at this and they saw a tree. I don't know how, but that is what they saw. And I think it's one of the cooler naming conventions with the brain. And then there are these folded ridges that are called folia. So if you think about foliage, they even named that and sort of related that to a tree. If that helps you remember, if you've forgotten, I just think it's cool when we come up with naming conventions that are creative and help us remember things. All right, your diencephalon or your thalamus, you need to know what it coordinates. What does that particular region do? All right, so the diencephalon or epithalamus is above, correct? So that's above the thalamus. These are note cards. You need to know the habenula and the pineal gland being this little lima bean sized thing, which I think you got an opportunity to see. Again, I'm not interested in structure. I want to know that you know that the epithalamus contains these things. All right, hang on, let me look at some. Okay, so here's what I want to bring up. The thalamus is also a portion of what is called the limbic system, that primal brain, that lizard brain that I have referred to a couple of times. So it plays a role in motor function, but what makes it a little bit different is how it plays a role in mood modification and emotional regulation. So damage to this particular area has some very interesting consequences. If you are more curious, I find the brain a really amazing thing and find myself, Googling interesting case studies that go with these sort of things, and they really help me put 2 and 2 together about how this stuff is working, where they were able to find individuals that had very specific regions that were damaged. and the thalamus in particular, when it is damaged, mood and emotional regulation, it varies, but sometimes it just sort of goes out the window because most of that does happen here. But I recommend that if you're curious, you can literally just Google this and find tons of stuff. All right, again, make sure that you know this terminology, make sure that you know what the afferent and efferent fibers are. Remember, afferent is information that arrives at your brain, so it's an input receiver, right? And efferent is information exiting your brain, if that helps you at all in remembering this. But again, hypothalamus, you can't see it, is super important in regulating mood, emotion, sexual pleasure, part of that lizard brain, satiation, rage, fear. So make sure that you have these straight and you understand the different portions of the diencephalon and how they work with one another. All right, again, this is anatomical information. You should have learned this in your lab. However, I'd like to point out that here is that term again, pia mater, that so many of you had questions on in the chapter 12 material. I addressed that in chapter 12, and I'd like to remind you that generally the structures that are associated with or traveling up the spinal cord, you will also find in the brain. So here you are, seeing this again. We have basically just moved up the body, and it is the same material that travels into the brain as well. And the subarachnoid, remind you of the spider webs and the super thin little tendrils that kind of wrap around everything. So we've talked about these terms in relation to the spinal cord, and it's exactly the same here. All right, again, you have an anatomical slide. You're not necessarily going to get any of this on your lecture exam, but it is there for your use. Again, another anatomical slide to help you orient yourself and sort of figure out where everything is. All right, ventricles. You should have covered most of this in your lab. You should have covered most of this in your lab. I want you to know which region the ventricles are associated with, and that and which are continuous. Like the fourth ventricle is continuous with the spinal cord. You do need to have an idea of where you're going to find that fourth ventricle. The third ventricle within the diencephalon region that we discussed, but that's all I need for that. This is, again, anatomical. You'll see a number of these, which I mentioned way up at the front. All right, cerebrospinal fluid bathes the brain and the spinal cord in this fluid that serves kind of like serous fluid that we discussed weeks ago at this point, about it being there for cushioning and protection. That is one of the functions of cerebrospinal fluid. There's more than that, but we'll get into that. So make sure you know that the chorioid plexus produces the cerebrospinal fluid, and that it is produced or found inside of each ventricle. Now here, this gives you a nice little layout of the direction the CSF actually flows. I'm going to move off of this slide because the next one is, it's a big picture of how the fluid flows. Now, you didn't really get to see this in lab, and this will become, you will realize why it's more important here in just a few slides as we get closer to the end of the lecture. But I want to point out that if you notice, the flow of the cerebrospinal fluid. It doesn't just kind of wash back and forth, like it actually has a directional flow that it tends to travel in. So understand which portion of the brain creates the cerebrospinal fluid, and understand the flow. That last slide, this last slide will help you envision it. I recommend that you kind of draw it and label it as you go along. All right. The last slide that I'm going to do for this particular part of the lecture is the blood supply to the brain. So your brain needs a ton of blood in order to work properly. And you all know that if you interrupt the blood flow to the brain, you go unconscious, and very, very soon after, you will start to get irreversible brain damage. And that's really because your brain needs oxygen, your brain needs glucose, your brain needs a lot of things that are available in blood in large quantities. So that being said, why in the world do we have cerebrospinal fluid instead of just blood sort of moving through that area to move nutrients and oxygen? We don't have our brain bathed in blood because blood is filthy. And it is not the sort of thing that you want flushing over your brain. There's an entire class called bloodborne pathogens that is way too short, but it helps you get certifications for certain things in the medical field that talks about protecting yourself from all the really gross and disgusting things that are found in blood. Viruses, bacteria, lots of other things that do not need direct contact with your brain. So there is a blood-brain barrier. There are only a couple of points where sections of your brain actually have contact with blood. And generally, those are the ones that are putting out some sort of hormone that needs to go into your bloodstream. So I want you to understand this slide pretty well. And I want you to know, if you look down here, where the 4 breaks in the blood-brain barrier are. And with each of those breaks, what do they do? So for example, the pituitary gland secretes hormones like oxytocin. The pineal gland has direct pineal secretions that need to go straight into your blood. So there are only 4 of them. Make sure you know that. There are 2 characteristics that determine the permeability of substances that need to get to your brain, or that will get to your brain, maybe not need to. Let me see if I can flip this. Maybe. No, I don't think that. Okay, I guess we're going to stick with this. All right, so lipid-soluble substances will pass straight through diffusion. So things like nicotine, ethanol, heroin, caffeine, all of that stuff just kind of permeates through, diffuses through on its own, hence why nicotine and caffeine, caffeine specifically, the one probably all of you, I could say with almost 100% certainty, all of you have had caffeine. It takes very rapid effects because it diffuses directly into your brain. It is lipid soluble. If you are curious or confused about this, go way back to our transport chapter and look at the section where before we even start talking about passive transport, you will see a phospholipid bilayer and you will see molecules bouncing off of it versus things that diffuse through it. Go back and take a look at that to make sure that you have why lipid-soluble things can diffuse straight through versus water-soluble things. Water-soluble things have got to go through mediated transport. Think about the properties of the phospholipid bilayer. The outside is hydrophilic, the inside is hydrophobic. Why do you think water-soluble substances need help? Make sure you have that straight. All right, I am going to stop there and I will pick this up with the last little piece of your lecture. Hopefully this helps you guys. Again, I got to learn to say this. Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you get the next lecture as I put it up.